Welcome to The Prescription, the Tax Policy Center's biweekly webcast on fiscal policy. This is one of a series of conversations with state, local, and federal government officials, as well as leading economists and other experts. I'm your host, Howard Gleckman, a senior fellow at TPC and editor of our blog, TaxVox. My guest today is George Callas. George was senior Republican tax counsel at the House Ways and Means Committee and tax counsel to former Speaker Paul Ryan. He currently is executive vice president of public finance at the philanthropy Arnold Ventures. And full disclosure, Arnold Ventures helps fund the Tax Policy Center. We'll be talking about what the midterm elections mean for tax policy this year and next. And a programming note, in 2 weeks on December 1st, our guest will be Archie Siddiqui, a former tax policy aide to Nancy Pelosi. She'll share a Democratic perspective on elections and taxes. Before we begin today's program, our usual bit of housekeeping. We encourage audience members to submit questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. The event is being recorded and will be posted online on TPC's website. We're using captioning, which you can adjust or turn off with the live transcript button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you'd like to join the conversation on social media, please use the hashtag #liveaturban. And if you'd like to suggest a future guest for The Prescription, just email us at info@taxpolicycenter.org. George Callas, welcome to The Prescription.
Hey, Howard, great to be here.
Good to see you. So let's do this in sort of chronological order and start with the lame duck. Congress is back for a few weeks. It's got to pass a budget, a defense authorization bill. Democrats and some Republicans are anxious to approve an election reform bill, and there's several tax bills on the table as well. So let's talk about the tax bills. There's a retirement savings bill, there's expiring business provisions, especially expensing research costs and bonus depreciation, and there's an expanded child tax credit. Which of these do you think is going to make it?
Well, I think to answer that question, we got to kind of step back and, over the years, I always had this line that I generally use before the election where I said, if you want to know what's going to happen in the lame duck, tell me the election results. Now, increasingly, I continue to use that for some period of time after the election has already occurred. And we're sort of kind of there. We know that Democrats are going to control the Senate by a very thin margin. It was called yesterday, I guess, that Republicans are going to control the House by a very, very thin margin. We don't know exactly how many, but given that the House always has a certain number of retirements and tragically deaths, passings every 2 years. Those a really thin margin can change and cease to be a margin potentially if it's too thin. So there's a lot of uncertainty there. But I use that line because even in a lame duck, even though the new Congress isn't in yet, knowing the election, negotiators have to know the election results to some extent to know what their leverage is in the lame duck and what their incentives are in the lame duck. And what's going to happen the next year drives a lot of that. So, here we are. And by the way, I asked Speaker Pelosi not to give a floor speech during this, but she apparently had her own schedule. And, we're going to find out for sure what her plans are, I think, in a few minutes. But in the lame duck, I always start with, when talking about a tax package, first you need to know if there's going to be a big appropriations deal, whether it's a complete omnibus or, a so-called mini bus that wraps up 4, 5, or 6 of the appropriations bills, because a short-term CR is not heavy enough to carry a robust tax title. As a threshold matter, you've got to get an appropriations deal. I don't know. I'm not an appropriations person. From what I can gather, there's a lot of uncertainty about whether that deal is going to come together. Some people are more optimistic in saying that Shelby and Leahy, the 2 lead Senate appropriators, are going to get a deal done because they're both retiring. Others are more pessimistic, and they'll say things like, how can Kevin McCarthy cut a deal with the Democrats before he's secured 218 votes to be Speaker on January 3rd? So there are reasons, and there are lots of other reasons too, cutting in both directions that make that very cloudy. So put that at 50-50 maybe. Then on the 50% chance that there is a big appropriations deal that's heavy enough to carry a tax title, clearly the retirement security stuff is the most sort of bipartisan on its own. And so I know there's a desire to get a retirement security package. That probably is, I don't want to say not, less about horse trading and more about just putting the package together. And there's some differences between the House and the Senate, but at the end of the day, it's bipartisan. They just have to put a package together. So that would probably have a high chance. Oh, I should say that, by the way, if there is an omnibus or a minibus, there's another threshold question about whether the leadership wants to even make it a revenue measure by attaching any tax provisions, right? Because once you attach one, you open the door to others. So even there, they could say, well, yeah, everybody agrees on this retirement package, but this can't be a tax vehicle. Because then other people are going to scream that their tax stuff isn't included, and we don't want to deal with that. We want to go home for Christmas. So there's that threshold question. Is it going to be a revenue measure? So if those two threshold questions work out, then I would think the first thing in is probably some kind of retirement security package. Then you get to this bigger trade-off that everybody talks about between sort of the ARPA or BBV version of the child credit, which are slightly different, but directionally similar. And then the three recently expired business tax provisions from the TCJA, R&D amortization, the 163J limitation, EBITDA versus EBIT, and bonus depreciation. And that becomes a difficult negotiation because I think everything, and there's a recognition of this, everything the Democrats want on the child credit is substantially bigger from a budgetary perspective. And Republicans do look at these things kind of on a permanent basis for sure. If you're looking at it on a permanent basis, definitely. But even if you do it for some period of time, it's significantly larger than the three business tax extenders. And I think Republicans, just as a threshold matter, say that's just not an even remotely close to even trade. So then the question becomes, how much are Democrats willing to turn the dials on the child credit that they want, knowing that the current child credit is much, much smaller than that? How much are they willing to turn the dials from a fiscal perspective, from a budgetary perspective, to be sort of symmetrical with the business provisions? There's also a couple of big policy, not just budget, but policy disputes there, that are going to be hard to resolve. The elimination of the earnings phase-in, which Republicans view as a work incentive or a labor force participation incentive, is a big issue. And then the advance payments is a big issue. A lot of Republicans view that as a temporary pandemic thing and don't think it should be permanent. So is it resolvable? Yes. I think there's a lot of things they have to clear to get it done.
So bottom line, assuming they can get past the thresholds that you talk about, and there's going to be at least some interest in doing a bill, would Republicans be willing to make a trade and accept full refundability of the credit, which is really the must do for progressives, in return for the business provisions?
Yeah, and I think that's really hard, right? Because if full refundability means getting rid of the earnings phase in, I think that's a non-starter. I mean, but you can dial that, right? You can dial the phase-in rate. You can lower the $2,500 threshold amount. So there are things you can dial. There's two dials in the earnings phase-in. And the question is, are Democrats going to be interested in dialing, or is it kind of an all or nothing full refundability? The other piece of full refundability is the $1,400 limit on the refundable part versus the $2,000 limit. And Republicans are very aware that $600 differential was actually just a swap for repealing personal exemptions in the TCJA. And so now you're bringing in those issues, the larger TCJA individual trade-offs that were made, which again makes it harder to sort through, I think.
So one more quick question about the lame duck, and then we'll talk about next year, and that's the debt limit. Some Democrats really, really, really want to get a debt limit addressed now so they don't have to deal with it next year. It's looking like a long shot. What do you think? Are they going to be able to pull it off?
I mean, the noises coming out of the Senate are that it's dead as a lame duck issue, right? Both Senate Democrats, I think Senator Durbin, and Senate Republican leadership have all agreed there's no, like, they're not going to do it on a bipartisan basis. And the Senate does not have the ability to process a budget resolution and a reconciliation bill to do it on a partisan basis. So I know there's a lot of folks on the House side who would like to get it off the table. Probably a lot of people involved in the financial markets who would like to get it off the table, and ordinary citizens like me. But the Senate, Senate Democrats and Senate Republicans sound like, frankly, they're singing from the same sheet right now, that it's not a viable lame duck issue.
So let's stick with the debt limit for a second. Is the conventional wisdom correct that this is going to be a bloodbath next fall?
You mean on the debt limit specifically?
On the debt limit, yeah.
Oh man. There's like two conventional wisdoms, right? Because there's like the policy people like us, conventional wisdom that it's going to be a bloodbath. And then there's the financial markets conventional wisdom, which is, oh, we've seen this game before. They're gonna play brinksmanship and take it right up to the deadline, and then they'll work something out. And it's gotten to the point where, it's like the crying wolf thing. The markets don't even really react that much anymore, because they assume that it's just a lot of bluster, and at the end of the day, we're going to work it out. Now, are the markets being sanguine about that? I worry that they are, and that they don't really appreciate just how difficult it's going to be to do it, just how much dysfunction there is, and that there might be some elected officials who really, really kind of do want to touch the hot stove, even though they're being told it's hot, and it's disturbing. But I've always said we're going to default on the debt, not because there's an intentional decision to default on the debt. No, almost no one's going to want to do it, but it's going to happen because nobody can figure out how to stand down.
Yeah, this is going to be a little bit like World War I.
Exactly. I was going to say it's like a lot of wars, right? A lot of wars start because nobody can figure out a way to back down, even though they don't really want to go to war. Same kind of dynamic potentially is what scares me most here.
So let's talk broadly about next year. Do you think that lawmakers are going to try to do serious legislating, or is it really going to be a year of message bills and investigations?
I think on the tax and sort of fiscal side, unfortunately, it's a statement against interest, right? It's going to be a lot of the latter. I think you might see a lot more action at Treasury. People are going to be really asking, what do they have the authority to do? Let's really figure out what they've got the authority to do. Kind of like what you saw in the later Obama year. Well, it's true of every administration, right? When you have divided government later on, it's hard to see. If you really, right, big tax bills get done one of two ways. They either get done in reconciliation on a partisan basis. Well, that you assume that's out, unless the House has a handful of retirements and it flips midterm. And then the other one is in December. That's basically it, right? You say, when was the last time? I mean, putting aside thematic bills that have a lot of non-tax stuff in them and also some tax stuff, like, for example, the CHIPS Act, putting aside stuff like that, like, you just don't see tax bills done under regular order in the middle of the year anymore. And part of that is because you put that on the floor in the Senate, and you've got a gazillion amendments that senators want, and they're not willing to vote until they get a vote on their amendment, and it just breaks down.
So speaking of regular order, Kevin Brady's retiring. There appears to be a three-way battle for chair of the committee between Vern Buchanan of Florida, Adrian Smith of Nebraska, and Jason Smith of Missouri. How's the outcome of that contest going to affect the committee?
There's so many unknowns right now and so many uncertainties, creating so many variables and so many different branches of how the future could go. I actually think that might be one of the least consequential, in the sense that I don't think there's a big delta between Adrian, Jason, and Vern on what their tax agenda would be at Ways and Means, just based on in isolation which one of them's holding the gavel. I think there's actually a lot of unity. You know, my time at Ways and Means Republicans, I mean, it was much more kind of, I mean, obviously every member has their priorities, but there is a team element, a team psychology there that maybe doesn't exist so much today at Senate Finance, where, you know, every senator is really trying to use it as a platform. But they all work together. They all, you know, those three all came on the committee at the same time. I was there at the time. They have very similar, they've been in the trenches together, you know, worked together on TCJ and a lot of other stuff. And I actually don't think it changes a whole lot depending on who wins.
So you've worked both in the Speaker's office and on the Ways and Means Committee. And in my time, what I've seen is the tax writing committee's influence has waned as more and more legislation is really written in the Speaker's office. Are we going to see more of that this year, or is that trend going to somehow flip?
It's a good question. You know, people say it's written in the Speaker's office. It's probably written less in the Speaker's office or the Senate Majority Leader's office, et cetera. A lot less than a lot of people assume, in the sense that just because the committee isn't voting and reporting something out doesn't mean that both the committee members and the committee staff are not involved in developing the product that then gets handed to the leadership. It just may be that there are reasons why, you know, they don't want to have to process it through committee. It's a little bit of a defense of the committee as an institution there, you know, for me, who's a great lover of the committee. I think you know, it's an unsatisfying answer, but it sort of depends on the topic and the product. I think the committee can process a lot of stuff that the House will pass, right? Or the House can pass. But then you get back into that dynamic of, well, when are we actually going to be making law? And in divided government, that probably means pretty much December for any big tax stuff. And in a December environment, it does become the leadership, even if they're taking the committee product, it really does become the leadership who's negotiating or putting together that deal. And different leaders give different deference to the committees, but you know, frankly, I've seen more deference on the Republican side than on the Democratic side. Part of that is by necessity, that the Republicans just have to be more sort of decentralized in order to avoid chaos, frankly. It's a demand, you know, from the ground up, from bottom up. But you know, in a December environment, of course, yes, that's going to give the leadership a much more hands-on role, and in divided government with no reconciliation, that's probably where you're going to see tax legislation.
So I guess everybody's asking the question, is Kevin McCarthy going to be Speaker, and what's he going to have to pay to get the job?
I'm actually in the camp that is the second question. It's really the critical question. Despite all the posturing and stuff about, you know, he's in real trouble, yada, yada. I think at the end of the day, Kevin McCarthy gets the votes for Speaker. But as you suggested, Howard, the question is, what concessions does he have to make in order to get that? And that's where it gets really tricky. You know, we were talking offline about this. I think one of the best, most important moves Speaker Pelosi made when she came back in after the 2018 election was in the rules package at the beginning of the Congress. She dropped the privilege motion to vacate the chair, which I've always described as a sword of Damocles. It hung over Speaker Boehner, it hung over Speaker Ryan. The ability of any rank and file member at any time to interrupt floor business with a privileged motion that's essentially like a motion of no confidence to remove the Speaker. And you know, you have to assume the minority is going to vote yes. And then if you've got a handful of rabble rousers in the majority, they've got the votes. I mean, that if that has to come back in as part of the deal to get the votes to be speaker, that is going to make it, that is going to have a huge impact on the speaker's ability to get things done.
So let's go through some of the issues that are going to come up in one way or another next year. So during the campaign, Republicans named two big legislative tax priorities. One of them was making the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act permanent, and the other was repealing the $80 billion in IRS funding that was included in the Inflation Reduction Act. So let's take them one at a time. Is the House going to vote to make the TCJA permanent, even though there's no chance the bill's going to pass the Senate and a less than zero chance the president would sign it? Are they going to go through the motions?
I think they could. I think they will if they have the votes, right? I think if they have the votes, it's an important. I'm not wearing that hat anymore, but House Republicans will do that because it's just so fundamental. I mean, they used to vote to make the 2001, 2003 tax cuts permanent, even though they knew it wasn't going to get through the Senate, right? It's just an important, huge thematic thing that they have to defend. And of course, House Republicans also have always hated the Byrd rule and the fact that it had to expire. They always wanted it. That the House version of the TCJA was permanent. And it was only, in conference that it had to be scaled back. So, but I said, if they have the votes, it is looking like there is a very good chance that the margin, the House majority will be less than, the number of, or roughly equal to the number of new members, Republican members coming in from New York and California and New Jersey, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think the biggest question on if they have the votes is the SALT cap. If they actually don't have the vote, if they don't have the votes for TCJA permanence, because that would include SALT cap permanence, then they wouldn't vote on it.
Yeah, it's an interesting question we've asked ourselves too. Is how does this change the SALT dynamics, and in perhaps in interesting, unexpected ways. The other one, of course, is the $80 billion in new IRS funding. A number of House Republicans have been extremely critical of it, have been saying they're going to get rid of it. It was interesting that Senator Crapo sent a letter to the IRS and Treasury earlier this year, where he didn't talk about getting rid of it. He wanted some transparency. He wanted some shifting of priorities, but not get rid of it. So given that dynamic, same question: are House Republicans going to actually vote to find a way to repeal the $80 billion when it's not going anywhere?
Yeah, so, full disclosure, Arnold Ventures works on that issue and has advocated for some time for increased funding for the IRS. We are, now that has happened, we consider that a victory in the IRA. Now that has happened, we are turning our attention to implementation and trying to ensure that the funding is, the agency digests the money well, because it's a big percentage increase over their base budget. But I think for many years, there was a slowly growing awareness amongst Republicans that the agency really did need more money, and that a lot of the problems that were associated with the agency, that a lot of people naturally attribute to malice, actually resulted from underfunding. And you had this sort of vicious cycle of here's another scandal, so let's cut their funding. Well, the funding cut makes future scandals more likely often. It's not necessarily malice, it's lack of training, lack of retaining good, employees with institutional knowledge, et cetera, et cetera. So, with all that, could the House have a symbolic vote on that? Yeah, they could have a symbolic vote on it. And it's hard to imagine that many House Republicans, knowing that it's symbolic because the Senate will ignore it, they would be under a lot of pressure to vote yes, to repeal the funding. But it doesn't go anywhere in the Senate, right? I think the more real risk is the annual appropriations process, because money is fungible. And if you've got an annual base budget and appropriations of roughly $12 billion, and then on average $8 billion a year from the IRA on top of that, well, maybe you can't cut the $8 billion, but you can cut the $12 billion, especially when you need more, when the appropriators need more money for defense, or for some labor HHS stuff that progressives want. I mean, it could be both parties, needing other stuff in appropriations. And so you could cannibalize the base budget, and you could justify it by saying, yeah, but they got this big plus up, so we're not really cutting them. And so I actually think that's the bigger risk as far as making law is concerned, as opposed to a symbolic vote.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And an appropriations bill, again, fast forward to the next fall, next winter, are Democrats willing to shut down the government to preserve funding for the IRS? Hard to see.
That's a tough position to defend, right? Like just politically. I'm not talking about the merits.
Right.
Politically, and I've long, people say, oh, Republicans always get the blame for a shutdown, and there are those of us who say no. It's the party that tries to use a shutdown as leverage to pursue an unrelated policy objective that gets the blame. That's almost always the Republicans. But the Democrats thought about doing it once on immigration and backed down really quickly because I think they realized that was true.
We just have a few minutes left, and let me quickly run through a couple of other issues. One of them is international tax. One way or another, the U.S. is going to have to consider Pillar 1 or Pillar 2 of the OECD's corporate tax reform. Do you think the next Congress is going to act on those issues, or is that just are we going to be waiting for other countries to act, and then sometime in the future we'll respond?
I think so I'll admit, and I don't know whether I'm an outlier in this or just sort of towards the end of one spectrum. I have never, it's not that I believe Pillar 1 is dead. I believe it was never alive. I've never, whether it's a 2/3 vote in the Senate for a treaty or a simple majority in both houses for some sort of, agreement, implementing agreement, I have never believed that the U.S. Congress would happily vote or even vote reluctantly to simply surrender taxing jurisdiction over U.S. companies to foreign tax authorities. People talk about what's the score of that? It'll be revenue neutral. I'm not so sure it'll be revenue neutral. So I've just never believed that was viable. And congressional Republicans attack it. Congressional Democrats, you can even see, I won't name names, but congressional Democrats are very polite when they talk about the Biden administration's work on Pillar 1. They're very wait and see, but you can read between the lines, like they're not really all that interested in it either. Pillar 2 is the bigger question, I think, and I think it's not just Pillar 2, like ring fenced. It's the larger question of balancing, and when we're working on this at Arnold Ventures, balancing mitigating profit shifting and protecting the U.S. tax base from erosion versus competitiveness and other economic policy considerations. And that partly depends on what other countries are doing. I think there is going to be continued efforts to reform especially the new international tax regimes that the TCJA created, GILTI, FDII, and the BEAT in particular. Whether the extent to which that's done officially as part of Pillar 2 compliance or just U.S. policymaking, because Congress continues to care about these issues, I'm not sure, but I do think that will continue to be an active area, indefinitely.
We have just a minute left, and Susan's done such a good job prognosticating about next year. A very fast question about 2024. So Donald Trump has already announced. Is there going to be a tax policy debate even among Republicans in 2024, or is this all going to be about Donald Trump and there goes all the oxygen in the room?
Yeah, you want to remind me that in 2020 the Republican Party didn't even have a platform at its convention, right?
Right.
Of course, again, my own interests are your interests. Most of the people at this event. We would really love to see a good tax policy discussion. When Trump is in the room, we know it's not about tax policy or much policy of any kind. It's about other topics, right? himself, democracy, elections, other grievances. So yeah, I am pessimistic. I think the pendulum may be starting to swing back, but it's going to take longer than 2024 to swing back to kind of, the way it used to be.
On that happy note, we are out of time. George Callas, thank you. It's always good to talk to you, and a happy Thanksgiving to you and to our audience. And again, in early December, we'll have a Democratic perspective on taxes in the next Congress. Take care.
Thank you, Howard. Happy Thanksgiving to everyone.
Thank you.